you all for coming. And welcome to Wonderland. We love to say that. Welcome to Wonderland. Our bookstore opened in mid-December. Kathy said I should say a word or two about the bookstore. So we opened in mid-December. My partner, Gail Weisswasser, is behind the counter there, and myself. Gail is a former lawyer, VP Communications, and we were in book club together. I was at the Post for many years, and she said, I've always wanted to open a bookstore. And I said, me too. And, you know, one thing led to another, and here we are. We are so excited to have Paula Whyman with us tonight. She's the author of Bad Naturalist, One Woman's Ecological Education on a Wild Virginia Mountaintop. Paula also writes a newsletter where she, as she says, geeks out on plants, insects, and wildlife. If you don't get this newsletter yet, you should. It's amazing. Paula discovered a property in Virginia that she thought would be a fun little ecology project as she found her way as an empty nester. This turned into a massive project, a mission to protect and restore the majestic land in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her discoveries are detailed with humor and humility in this book and in her newsletter. Her words are beautiful and educational, even for those of us with tiny postage stamp backyards. And Paula is joined here in conversation with by Kathy Jentz, the author of Ground Cover Revolution and the Urban Garden, and the editor of Washington Garden Magazine. And she is just, so many people have come in this week very excited about the event tonight. You're both really well known in the area. On a personal note, I love my tiny backyard garden and raised beds almost as much as I love books, so I can't wait to hear this conversation.
Thank you all for spending your Tuesday evening with us. It was a beautiful spring day. I had to eat outside because it was so gorgeous. And Paula, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this.
And are you super excited about your first book? Is this your first in print?
This is my first book of nonfiction.
Nonfiction,
Yeah.
correct. Okay. So we'll get that straight. We'll talk about, so maybe we'll have time to talk about the fiction one before. So, because it does say her first nonfiction book. I should have read that more. So we met virtually because her book came across my desk as a review copy. And then I have the Garden DC podcast that comes out every Saturday. And I said, this is a great topic for a podcast. So I looked it up, you're episode 224. It was back in January. And I renamed the book a little bit for the title of the podcast, The Reformation or Reformation of a Bad Naturalist.
I like that.
So that does bring up why the name of the book. Are you a bad naturalist?
Well, I will say that when I started out, I didn't know anything about plants. My background and interest, I've always been passionate about nature. When I was a kid, I was really into bugs. I would let cicadas crawl on my arms and legs. I would look under rocks to see what was there. And so I came to this project from an interest in wildlife and ecology, and not an particular interest in or knowledge of plants. So, in fact, I'm historically a terrible gardener, which when you consider that I somehow stood on a mountaintop and looked out at 200 acres of land, which was 75 or 80 acres of old fields that used to be pasture, and about 130 acres of forested slopes, and said, yes, I can do this, given that I really had no history with plants. That was maybe, but I didn't think about that. I was hooked by the idea of bringing back native plants to this landscape.
Excellent. And then what made you think to make that journey into a book?
Well, maybe I should start by saying how I got to this place to begin with, because Bill, my husband who's here, Bill and I were looking for the proverbial place in the country. We wanted to live a more outdoor life, and we had been sort of looking off and on for, about 30 years, right? And then when our kids were older and off adulting, it seemed like now was the time when we could really look in earnest. So we started maybe around 2019, and we focused in our search on the northern Blue Ridge area, like the Piedmont and the northern Blue Ridge. And we were looking for a house and a small piece of land where Bill could be an Eagle Scout, which is what he is, and I could, investigate insects and just kind of plant a vegetable garden, and I even had this idea that I would raise a few sheep. And at the same time, I was thinking about native plants because I had read Doug Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope about, his homegrown national park movement and the idea of bringing back native plants to your yard and replacing, non-functional lawn to help pollinators and so on. And I had read a book called Wilding by Isabella Tree, which was all about one farmer's effort to allow a 3,000 plus acre farm in England to go back to nature. So I had all that in mind. I thought, okay, wherever we end up, I'm going to plant a small native meadow, small like an acre or two, native meadow, and I'll put my writing shed next to it, and I'll watch the birds go by, and I'll watch the flowers and the breeze and everything. It was very obviously romanticized. And then someone said, well, while you're looking in this area, you have to go see the view on this mountain because it's pretty amazing. It's really unusual. It's like nothing else you'll see here. So we said, okay. So the next time we were in town, it happened to be August and a bright, hot day. We said we would go see the view while we were looking at houses. And so we went to this place, and there was a gravel road at the bottom of the mountain that kind of ended way before the top of the mountain. So we hiked up most of the way. It was about 3/4 of a mile. And we came out of the woods to this open area, which still, even though it was open, we couldn't see very far because the plants were literally over our heads. There were these yellow flowers that were over 6 feet tall, everywhere, and just dense foliage, dense growth, and bees and birds and everything. And this was an old cow pasture that had gone to seed, so nothing had been done to it in a few years, and everything had just grown up. And they had just mowed a little path so that you could just enough space to walk up. So we walked up to this high point and looked out, and as far as I could see were these rolling hills of these 6 foot tall yellow flowers and all kinds of bird things that I didn't know what they were, and these forested slopes. And I looked at, and it was about 75 acres of open fields on top of a mountain, which in the Northeast is very unusual to find a mountaintop that wasn't forested, which I can talk about later if you want. But in that moment I thought, okay, well, my plan to plant like a 1 acre native meadow seems very unambitious in this. I can look out and see all of this land here that is just, asking for somebody to, do something to help. And I thought, well, I could really make a difference there. So how did that become a book? Well, I have this habit of sort of deep diving on things, and I have to be in that mind frame to write a book. So at the time I was working on a novel. I had been working on a novel for a while, and I couldn't even tell you now what that book was about. I don't remember it at all, because as soon as I started this mountain project, I just realized that it was all I could think about. I had so many questions, and there was so much that I didn't know, and that was what I thought about. That was what was in my head all day long, and that's how I have to be when I'm writing a book. So at some point, I think, a few months into that project, I thought, okay, well, this is clearly going to be, I'm going to have to write about this somehow, because I can't write about anything else.
That's the best reason to write a book, because you can't write about anything else. And I always hear other authors say, this is my last book, never again. Because it's like giving birth. They're like, oh, this is it. But you mentioned sheep, so maybe tell the sheep story.
Oh, well, I don't have the sheep yet, but I really wanted sheep when I was maybe 10. I don't remember exactly how old I was. I became a junior farmer because I had this idea that for a while I wanted to be a large animal vet, like James Herriot, preferably in the Yorkshire Dales, like James Herriot. And I wanted to learn, when you're a kid, wildlife and livestock get kind of mixed together, like they're the animals that you have access to. All the songs that you sing when you're a kid are about farm animals. So I didn't really separate farm animals in my mind from other animals. And I wanted to somehow work with animals. So I worked at this farm, which was called Old McDonald's Farm, and it was part of Wheaton Regional Park. It is not there anymore, and I can tell you why. It's a very sad story, but at the time, people were always trying to like feed the goats too much, you know. They had these little dispensers, and you put the, you get a handful of food and feed the goats. Anyway, I would groom the animals and feed the animals and, shovel out the stable and stuff. It was a really fun job. But at some point, I decided that being a veterinarian involved a lot of death. Dealing with a lot of death, and I didn't want to do that. So I decided not to become, the female James Harriet. But I've always been interested in sheep, and it turns out that sheep can be useful on this particular mountain because there are certain invasive plants, certain very undesirable, aggressive plants that sheep will eat and not drop dead, because there are other plants that sheep will eat and drop dead. Apparently, sheep are not good at knowing the difference. But sheep, goats, so it can be useful to have those animals in a limited way if you're dealing with a large piece of land, and it's one way of managing some aspects of it.
And it's free animal food. All those invasive.
I don't know if I could. Oh yeah.
But on the subject of invasives, what was there when you moved in, and that you were like, this has to go immediately?
Oh. Well, I didn't know right away what was there. I had to consult a bunch of people who knew more than I did and had more experience than I did. So I started learning about all the resources in the area, that there were all these nonprofit conservation organizations and government departments and everything from the State Department of Forestry to the USDA to the Smithsonian and private nonprofit research organizations that would come out and walk the land with me and teach me about what I was seeing. It was sort of like getting a crash course in ecology. It was extremely helpful. But one of the first things that I learned was how to recognize some of the major invasive plants that we had on the property. And one of these was the tree of heaven, which became like my first nemesis in a sense. And the tree of heaven, some of you may know, is the host plant for the spotted lanternfly. We didn't have spotted lanternflies on the mountain until last summer, and I could really do without them. So the tree of heaven, there's one called the princess tree or Polonia. The autumn olive is a shrub, but calling it a shrub makes it sound like it's little. It actually gets really huge. Spotted knapweed is a flower that comes from Europe, and it has spread so much in parts of western rangeland that elk are dying because they can't find food. Because one of the things invasive plants will do is form a monoculture. They'll make it so that nothing else can grow around them, and they'll spread and create this density. And most native wildlife can't use them, can't eat them. And they don't have any predators because they left their predators back home. So native plants here have predators to keep them in check. The invasive plants have a big advantage because they have developed all of these different interesting ways to reproduce to get around the predators that don't exist here. So it's easier for them to run rampant.
Mm-hmm. So you had these great resources and consultants that came out, and what was their first advice for you?
Well, the first thing that happened, and one of the best things about all of these groups is that they didn't charge me anything. I mean, they're all like their whole goal is to help inform people. And one of the first things I did was contact the Smithsonian's Conservation Biology Institute, which has a division called Virginia Working Landscapes, and their goal is to help landowners and farmers figure out how to, first of all, what plants and animals they have on their land, and how to encourage the desirable ones. And they also do a lot of research, so they do surveys. So they came out and did a plant and bird survey on the mountain. That was one of the first things that happened. So I then had a baseline list of like, what are the dominant plants and what are the dominant birds. And they're actually coming back now. This was 4 years ago. And they're coming back this spring to do a new survey. So I'll be able to, I'll have that data and see what do we have, and I hope it's going to be better. What do we have now? Do we have more native plants, plant varieties? Do we have more birds?
I'm sure. I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised with your results, I'm going to predict. So that was my alarm to say, I'm going to ask a couple more questions and we're going to open it up to the floor. So I always like to ask authors about their writing practice. So are you the type that get up first thing, 5 a.m. and straight to the computer? Or are you more like, I'm going to wander and do a bunch of other things, and then when it strikes me, I'm going to write?
Yeah, I haven't seen 5 a.m. in a long time. I'm an empty nester. I don't have to get up that early anymore. I tend to have trouble getting up in the morning, which is not great. But I'm sort of a late morning to whenever I'm forced to stop kind of writer. And a lot of what I do, especially on the mountain, is wander in the meadow with my journal and my phone and take notes and take pictures and see, what's different. I stop like every few feet and stare at a plant to see if I can find an interesting bug on it. and so that's a lot of my writing time, is actually wandering around, seeing what I can see and taking notes, and then coming back and reflecting on it for a while before I actually write anything.
And your book is almost poetic, literary in some places. Who are your influences?
That's a great question. Well, I really love Virginia Woolf, and in fact, when I was in grad school, I wrote a paper about her use of symbols of nature. So maybe that was sort of prescient. I don't know. Yeah.
So, and you said Doug Talmy, of course, on the other side of the being influenced by.
Yeah. And Isabella Tree, I'm influenced by their work, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And also Braiding Sweetgrass, Margaret Rankel's Late Migrations, Annie Dillard. Let's see, I know I'm going to forget someone. There's a great book called The Rural Life by Verlin Klinkenborg, about his farm. Just a good list.
All right, I think we're going to open it up to all of you. Any burning questions from the audience?
So do you live out there full time now?
Almost. We actually, so one of the things that I left out is one of the problems with this place when we first saw it is that there was no house. We were looking for a house. There was no house, there was no power, there was no water. There was not even really a road that went all the way up. So it was a real leap of faith to decide to do what we did. The house was just finished a few months ago, but now we're there, most of the time.
And where was home? Was not too far down the road prior to
Bethesda.
that.
Yeah.
Way in the back. I'm going to repeat the questions for the camera.
How did you put together your plan of how to steward the land that you had? And I know it's not her question, but what does your kind of average day look like when you're,
So she's
stewarding the
asking
land?
your average day and how you planned out the work for converting your land.
Well, in the process of talking with all of these experts, who at times gave me conflicting advice because they were very, very knowledgeable and experienced in each of their fields, but sometimes the conservation biologists didn't necessarily agree with the foresters. It was that. So I had to make a lot of decisions, and one of the things that surprised me that I didn't really understand about conservation was that there's no one right answer that will work every time. And there's no, like, here's what you do, 1, 2, 3, okay, you're done. That was a surprise to me, I guess. I don't know why, but so I had to like sort of absorb all of this advice and then come up with a plan. And so much of the time, I mean, the largest part of the plan is probably dealing with the invasive plants. It's probably more than 80% of my time. So the other day, I was out there with my weed wrench, and I pulled up about 3 dozen young autumn olive shrubs. And another time, I picked a hillside and pulled up a bunch of Jimson weed, which is another invasive plant. So how do I spend my days? I spend my day partly wandering in the meadow and taking notes and trying to discover, because one of the most fun things and exciting things for me is discovering the interconnections among the various creatures and plants, things that I really wasn't aware of before. Like, I didn't know how that voles, which if you have a garden, you hate voles, probably. I didn't know how important voles are in a meadow and for the regeneration of oaks, which was something I learned by doing research on what I was seeing in the meadow. Like, how do I have so many voles here? Why? What are they doing? Yeah, so that's part of my day, and part of my day is figuring out where I need to stop what invasive plant this week.
I think we can talk forever about Jimson weed, because there are some great stories around that. But when you mentioned that various consultants, you know, some are coming from entomology side of things, some are coming from botanical.
Yeah.
I always say, ask 2 gardeners, get 3 opinions, and it always starts with, it depends. So there was a hand right there.
Yeah, great project. That's just what you mentioned kind of in the beginning, that it was rare that there weren't trees on the top of this, that you had this kind of vista looking out. Was there something specific about the land that where trees don't grow on it well, or was it just historically that it had been a pasture or something, they actively got rid of the trees?
That's a great question. And initially I thought it was because of the agricultural history of the land, because it had been a cattle pasture from the 1970s until we bought it. And before that, for 150 years, it was an apple orchard, like the whole mountain. Farmers planted orchards on mountains because there was less of danger of frost. And so it was a very successful apple orchard for a long time, and I just assumed that that's why the land was open. But it turns out, so a scientist from an institute that studies grasslands came out and wandered around the mountain and said he thought that the mountaintop had been open for far longer, that it had been savanna, a large part of it. Partly from what he could see of the rock outcroppings, because we have a lot of rock outcroppings, and the types of plants that were growing, and just the fact that, and he said it would have been maintained as meadow by lightning-induced fires every few years. And there's a 300-year-old oak that was definitely growing, that grew in the open. It was clear that it grew in the open from the shape of the tree, because if you see a tree that grows in a forest, it's sort of narrower, it has to stay narrower. But this tree is like wide and full, and it's on like, you know, sort of near the edge of a slope, near the top of a slope. So it's buffeted by wind and everything. And it's clearly been in the open for 300 years, and I don't think it was planted intentionally. So it's likely, and probably if we did studies, there you can find charcoal evidence of, you know, fires. You can find fossil evidence of grassland plants that might have grown there at one time. So, I don't know, something to aspire to do.
So what's your intention? Like in 5 years, if you could snap your fingers, what would it look like? Or in 10 years, what would it look like?
Well, if I could, in 5 years, I would have no invasive plants, and it would be all native plants. But I don't know. Sometimes I think this is realistic, and sometimes I don't. But I'm aiming for 80% native plants. It's probably not realistic, just because we have so many deer, and the animals are always just bringing in seeds, and the wind brings in seeds, and the fact is that all the lands around us have the same invasive plants, so they're always going to be brought in. We're always going to be fighting them. But my goal is to tip the balance of the meadows toward native plants, and also to work on the forest understory similarly. The forest understory isn't so terribly invaded with non-native plants, but the problem is there's almost no understory because of the deer. But we were told by a forester that if we manage the invasive plants in the meadow, they'd be less likely to get in the forest. So
there's this gentleman, and then lady, and then.
I think I seem to remember our kids clearing out invasive plants when they were Cub Scouts. What I didn't understand quite is, do you expect the native plants to come in by these natural mechanisms, or do you intend to plant your own ideas of what native plants you'd like to see there?
That's a great question. I assumed that we would have to do a lot of planting, but early on, and this was pretty consistent, that the experts I spoke with said, looking at the plants that we had, because we have native plants, and there were native plants there when we started, there were just not enough of them, and not enough variety, that there were native plants in the seed bank, in the soil, waiting to grow. They just couldn't compete for light, and there was so much thatch from all the non-native hay grasses and the fescues that had grown there that it was hard for them to get through. So one of the things that I wanted to do was burn, to get rid of that thatch and clear out to see what would come up out of the seed bank. And we did that, and it was actually a successful experiment. The other reason planting isn't really advised on most of the land is because it's highly erodible, dry, rocky, hilly, and if you try to, there are very few ways of planting that don't disturb soil to the degree that it could cause a lot of erosion. So the first step is to get rid of the plants that are in the way, and then see what comes up in the seed bank. And so far, I've been pretty happy with that aspect of things, except when invasive plants come up, because they're also in the seed bank.
As one moved out west for a time, is fire a concern at all?
That's a great question. So we are trying to do controlled burns, and that should decrease fire risk, negative fire risk, I guess. You probably know that part of the reason things burn out of control and we get those tragic fires is because fire was suppressed for so long, and because non-native plants have been allowed to sort of take over. So that combination of things is a fire risk. By trying to do prescribed burns, we're hoping to decrease the risk of an out of control fire. And they're very careful when they do those burns. They literally, when they cut a fire line to keep the fire contained, they literally turn over the sod so that it's like a 5 foot wide or 8 foot wide dirt lane that goes around the field that they're going to burn, which, it's good because the fire doesn't escape, but it's bad because then usually invasive plants grow in that dirt lane. So, double-edged sword.
Yep. Yeah, that weed seed bank is deep.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of weed pressure on the East Coast. You were next.
Yeah, I have so many questions. It's so interesting. We did a similar thing in West Virginia, and we're now trying to. I highly recommend goats. They're amazing and silly. But what is your calculus when you mention the fire lane? I'm always hesitant to what do you do to deal with these things? Like, how do you feel about pesticides and or herbicides, or what advice have you gotten to deal chemically with the invasives? And have you vetoed that or?
That was a real dilemma.
Mhm.
I'm sort of committed to not doing broad spraying because I just think it's bad for everything. There are certain plants that you just can't get rid of without chemicals, but what I've tried to do is stick to the spot treating.
Okay.
So with invasive trees, you can treat them directly. You don't have to spray them. You can actually cut notches in the trunk and feed in the chemical, so it's only harming that plant.
Mhm.
And when we have an invasive vine coming up, we spot spray it.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's kind of ridiculous over that number of acres, and it means that things are always going to be sort of getting out of control. But if you spray everything, you're basically killing everything. So it defeats the purpose. To me, it defeats the purpose. Although there were the way the USDA, the NRCS does things, they do a lot of spraying.
Mm.
But some of the conservation groups I worked with were a little more conservative about that. So I was weighing those different options.
So how many laborers do you have?
2. Yeah, no, we at one point are you familiar with Mount Cuba in Delaware? It's a native plant garden started by a DuPont family member. And I went there and looked at it because I really wanted to see how they manage their native plants. And the way they manage them was by having a big endowment, a large staff, and a lot of volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you're a nonprofit, you're probably not going to have the Cub Scouts come in and clear out the invasive plants. So it's been, it's tricky. It's slow.
Well, rent those goats that she was talking
Yeah,
about.
that's something I would like
Yes.
to do that.
And have a weeding party, like people have paint parties. There was a hand way in the back. Was there any questions?
I
Okay.
was just gonna say that I really liked the Annie Dillard shout out. I went to her school, the same graduate school in Pittsburgh. But my other question is, I'm an educator, exploring the writing field, and can you just explain a little bit more about your inquiry process in terms of your note taking, and then how you translate into writing, just in general?
Sure. So when I started this project, I would go on walks on other people's farms who would talk about what they did to get rid of invasive plants and encourage natives on their land. And I was always furiously writing notes, including bits of dialogue, even though at that point I wasn't planning on writing a book. And people were always sort of suspicious of me, why was I taking so many notes? But then I would go back and I would sort of type up what I remembered, and I would then be able to fill in what the landscape looked like, the details, and so on. And I would kind of let that sit for a while. Now when I was writing the book, because the book sold on the basis of a proposal, so I had written, sample chapters and chapter summaries, and but I hadn't written the book when I sold it, and I had a year and a half to write it, and I was doing the things that I was writing about at the same time that I was writing about them. So for instance, I was waiting to see if there would be a prescribed burn, and I had this whole chapter planned about fire, and I thought, what is going to happen? I asked my literary agent, what am I going to do if we don't get a burn? And she said, well, write about the failure. And I said, well, I can do that. So that was sort of my process. I would sort of freak out that I wasn't going to be able to get something, get the information that I needed or get the scene that I needed. And then I would just suddenly find something, like something would happen, like I would make this discovery about voles or about this particular caterpillar that turned out to be carnivorous. And then I would like go down that rabbit hole and it would turn into something. That's my process. I write too much and then I cut a lot.
Do you have a favorite season on the mountain so far?
I really like fall. When the hills get, like, there's a lot of broom sedge and little blue stem and Indian grass and these grasses that get kind of brown or red, orange, and the hillsides look sort of golden. And so I like every season has its own attraction, I think, but I really like fall.
Nice. And so one of your goals was to attract insects. So any plants in particular that you've had success with?
Well, we do have a lot of milkweed. So we have
the common milkweed?
Common milkweed,
Okay.
yeah. We have a lot of milkweed. We have dogbane. There's a beetle called dogbane. Is a plant that's related to milkweed. It also has sort of fluffy seeds, but they're long, kind of look like bean pods. And there's a dogbane beetle that's sort of iridescent and rainbow colored, and I always like finding that beetle for some reason.
Yeah, the milkweed has that red beetle.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
there are a couple kinds of milkweed beetles. That are red. Some of them are flat, some of them are sort of lumpy. Technical terms.
And you know, one of your original plans was to have a vegetable patch. Have you done any edible gardening there?
I haven't started the vegetable garden yet because I needed to be living there in order to do that.
Yes.
But I have set out a place for it. I've sort of, made a plan for it, and I think it's going to be fall before I actually get it in there.
What are the water sources on site?
Yeah.
Every time I think vegetable patch, I'm like, oh, you're gonna be hauling water.
I won't tell you how many dry wells we drilled before we decided to use the old well that was there from when it was a cherry orchard in the 80s possibly, or anyway, the well that was there was put in before permits, and we got the whole thing inspected by the state and relined and all this stuff. Problem is, it's a half mile from the house. So we do have water, and it's good water. It tastes good and all that.
Nice. There's a hand.
I was gonna ask about the water source, or if
Yeah.
there was a pond, or, but the way that you described it coming in, you said the gravel road goes up and then you go up from there. So is it a plateau or like rolling hills or?
It's rolling hills.
Okay.
Yeah, you're basically going up a steep slope for about a mile from the paved road, and then you come to the meadow, and the meadow kind of goes like this. And at each end, there's actually one end that has it's still meadow, but it sort of plunges down toward the trees, and we call that the sledding hill. Except I wouldn't recommend sledding. And there's an even steeper hill at the other end that, and when I say the other end, they're probably like a half mile away from each other. So
No creeks or anything going through?
there is a
Must have
stream.
something.
There's actually a stream that they used to use, and there's an old spring box in this stream that they used in the 1830s for the apple orchards. And we're hoping, we actually did, the one thing that we did plant with the help of a nonprofit called Friends of the Rappahannock that helps clean up rivers. They planted a bunch of trees in our riparian area, and I'm hoping that someday there will be a beaver there. That's my dream. We also planted a bunch of trees down a steep erodible slope that is, in the river watershed. So, and everything we planted is a native fruit or nut bearing tree. So pawpaws, hickory, oak. So we hope that we'll also see a lot of wildlife besides deer. We do have bears.
Who are your neighbors? Like, are they helping with this process or hindering with the process?
Everyone has their own thing. All right, we do have a bunch of I guess in the country they call them adjoiners. But no, we have neighbors. I guess down the hill. On one side we have an apple orchard. It's one of the few remaining apple orchards in the county because most of the apple orchards 50 years ago or so transitioned to cattle. There just got to be too much competition from New York and Washington for apples, I guess. But that apple orchard's over 100 years old, I think. And then we have some farms, some other farms around us, and just woods.
So another author that I had interviewed on my podcast not that long ago was all about southern apples. So, and she talked all about all the heirloom apples that existed, pre-1950s, and we've lost a lot of them. So do you have any remaining older apple trees on your property?
I listened to that episode. It was really fascinating to me. We had one remaining apple tree because what happened was the person who owned the land before we did, who bought it in the 70s, she decided to transition the orchard to cattle, and she basically bulldozed all the apple trees except for one. So there was one apple tree when we bought the land that was kind of in sad shape. It was old. I mean, I have no idea how old it was. It was more than 50 years old. And last year it keeled over. I think the roots must have been, but we had one season of apples. And they were good. I think they might have been York, but it's hard to know.
Yeah, they're not long-lived trees, so it's not surprising. All right. Any last questions? I think we're gonna wrap it up.
What were the yellow flowers?
Great question. So when I first saw those yellow flowers,
She's asking what were the tall yellow flowers?
I assumed they were weeds because the person who brought us up there called them stickweed, which if you're a farmer, you don't want them because the cows can't eat them and they leave these tall stems that are really stiff. You kind of have to break them almost like a branch. So I did a deep dive trying to find out about stickweed, and of course everything I looked up said, oh, this is hard to kill, it's aggressive, perennial, and all this stuff. I was like, oh no! And then I realized I was asking the wrong question, maybe. And I looked it up a different way because I realized no one said this was an invasive plant. They're just saying it's a pain. So then I looked it up as a native plant, and it was yellow crownbeard, which I don't know the Latin name, but I don't know the Latin name of anything. but yellow crownbeard is great for pollinators. It blooms in August and September. I guess these sort of raggy looking yellow flowers, and it can get like 6 to 8, 10 feet tall. And soldier beetles love it. It's a good native plant. If you have it in your garden, it might try to take over. But if you have it on a mountaintop where there's a bunch of other things, it really doesn't matter. It is stickweed, but it's also great if you have native meadow.